Hello, good people, and welcome to Hillbilly Cat History Spiritual Quest. For today, we're moving through Chapter 9 of The Impersonal Life by Joseph Benner. And we're also looking through Chapter 9 of the Book of John, fourth book of the New Testament. And we're going to be doing all that just as soon as we come back from this song, Truth That Sounds Like Lies.
No whisper in the family halls, no doctor's word, no shadowed calls. We searched the papers after he was gone. No cancer written, no sickness drawn. Yet silence breaks in fractured skies. Truth that sounds like lies. Charlie spoke with kindness deep, repeating words he thought to keep, protecting Elvis, guarding flame, or echoing voices without a name. A loyal friend, a gentle guide, truth that sounds like lies. Three voices sing in broken time, each one honest, each one blind. The story bends, the rumor flies, truth that sounds like lies. Fracture born of love's disguise, truth that sounds like lies.
At Graceland's door the doctor came. Vernon ill, his body lame, a secret spoken, hushed and great. Bone cancer spread beyond the grave. I carried words with tearful eyes, truth that sounds like lies.
Cells that look like death's disguise, stained and studied, no disease inside. Not cancers marked but nature in. Her body a breaking, nothing to mend. Science clears but rumor cries, truth that sounds like lies. Each heart believed what it was told, each hand held fragments, shards of gold. But when the pieces fail to bind, the world calls false what's true inside. Three voices sing in broken time, each one honest, each one blind. The story bends, the rumor flies, truth that sounds like lies. Fracture born of love's disguise, truth that sounds like lies. In the silence of the king's last song, truth and rumor both belong. A sacred ache beneath the skies, truth that sounds like lies.
Thank you all for gathering here at Hillbilly Cat History, where we remember together and listen for the echoes. And today we're going to hear echoes from Graceland. But first, we're going to look at this page that Elvis underlined in The Impersonal Life. He underlined this paragraph, and all we can see in this image is really this one paragraph. Now, he didn't underline the very beginning, but let's go ahead and read those words anyway. It says, "You must realize by this time I have allowed you all things. And the I is the I am who lives in your heart, the God who speaks to you from the inside. It's your direct communication line with the Almighty." And this is saying that God has allowed us all things. Now, Elvis didn't underline this part of the passage. He underlined the next part, which is all you have or are, be it of good or evil, of blessing or suffering, of success or failure, of riches or lack, I have allowed you or attracted to you. Why? For use, in awakening you to a recognition and acknowledgement of me as the giver of all that is good. So Elvis underlined most of that passage, and it's stating that good, evil, blessing, suffering, success, failure, riches, lack, these are all things that Elvis has had. He's had riches and he's had lack. And he's had success and he's experienced some failures. He's been blessed, but he also suffers. And he's in an industry where his good is mixed with the evil of others. And this passage is saying that it's all for a purpose. And that purpose is to awaken Elvis to a recognition and acknowledgement of me as the giver of all that is good. It's also implying, and Elvis didn't underline the giver of all that is good, but he's underlined so much of the passage that the implication of the giver of all that is good is that all of these things that have been listed, good, evil, blessing, suffering, success, failure, riches, lack, all of them are good. The giver of all that is good. And this resonates with Elvis. That's why he underlines it. And he already has a recognition and acknowledgement of his inner voice. What this book is terming the I am, or the direct line to God. Hi, Pat. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. So this passage is, I think, telling Elvis, and he's agreeing with it, that your life is a journey. And that journey is about orientation. And it's about either being aligned or it's about being misaligned, because that's actually the message of this book, in which he's made these underlines. And so part of the awakening to a recognition and acknowledgement is alignment, which I tend to think of as a compass, with north being to Jesus and south being away. That's misalignment. And there's all the points of the compass in between, and we live somewhere in those other points most of the time. It's imperative to stay north of the east-west meridian and to push yourself as far north as possible. But there's also a recognition in the text, which is reflecting the Bible, that it's not about being in a certain state of being. It's about where you're walking to, who you're facing, your orientation being aligned. That the alignment will skew, but you can realign over and over. And it's the willingness to realign, to continue to push forward, even though you feel that you've been stopped, but to not turn around. And now let's move over to the text itself. And we're in chapter 9 of this book, which is telling us about the Garden of Eden. But it's telling us about the Garden of Eden as orientation, either being aligned or being misaligned, and trying to realign. That part of the journey is the realignment. Part of the journey is understanding there is alignment, because there's a lot of interference in our thoughts with that. And that's what this chapter is actually explaining, is where does that interference come from? That we were sent here as a shard of the divine, with a direct communication line back to the divine, because we're a piece of the divine. We express an attribute of the divine. And this chapter has explained that we're sent here, we still have that direct link. We're giving a soul body. Now, when I read that earlier, I was thinking that was our mortal body. But we're about to learn in this portion of the text that there's a distinction here, but we're given some kind of form. And then now we're going to get into the part where we're given this mortal shell, and it's the mortal shell that creates the interference, but is necessary for the expression of the attribute, of the divine attribute that we were sent here to express. The mortal shell is necessary for that on this plane of existence. And that's kind of where we're at. So we'll start in. It says, we have arrived in the course of our consideration of the process of unfoldment of my idea. So that is a very wordy way to say that Joseph Benner has been telling us about the book of Genesis and how the earth was created. And the unfoldment of my idea is the project that Benner has also referred to as the real earth. And that the earth we're on is that project in process. We have not yet arrived at the real earth. We could think of the real earth as a painting, an enormous, gigantic painting. It's the size of the universe. And God is the painter. And he's painting this wonderful real earth, which he's told us is going to at some point condense into the perfect expression of the word in this realm. And so there is an endpoint to the project, and God's already there, because there's no time, not for God. Time is something we experience. And that's what's being done here in this chapter, is God's experience of no time is being slowed down into discrete pieces so that we can see a sequence, because that's what our brains, which perceive time, require in order to understand these thoughts. So far, Benner's told us that I told you about this painting, the real Earth, and we've arrived at a point where I'm going to tell you something else. He's taken a long time to say it. And now the point of this paragraph is to where the I am of you, that's the God in your heart speaking directly to you, to where the I am of you manifesting in your immortal soul body or in the thought image created by my thinking. So this soul body, the soul is the divine shard. That's our eternal selves that's eventually going to return to unity. Although it's already part of unity. But it's a piece that God has broken off for this project, the real Earth. And then he's wrapped it in this thought image. His thinking, his imagination has created an immortal soul body. Now, what is that? I'm going to guess, because I don't really know, that it's something akin to Plato's concept of an ideal form. So Plato had this idea. He was an ancient Greek thinker. But he had this idea that we could picture an object in our mind, in our imagination, and it would be perfect. And that would be the ideal form of that object or that concept. So we could use as an illustration a chair. We've all sat in chairs. We all know what a chair is. When I say the word chair, we all get a picture in our mind of a chair. That probably is your ideal chair. Now, maybe it was a real chair that you knew, that you sat in, that you loved. Or maybe it's a chair that you've never experienced and that incorporates all the best things of all the chairs that you've ever used or thought about. Maybe you've had an idea about how pillows could be put on a chair in a special way, and that forms your concept of an ideal chair. And that ideal is perfect. And it's immortal in the sense that that idea could potentially last forever. Nothing detracts or, ideas, they don't have a mortal life like we do. We can lose the idea, but it's not exactly the same. But we have these thoughts of an ideal something. This is what Plato thought. And I think that's what Benner is saying in God has imagined a perfect soul body, the immortal soul body. And he's wrapped that around the divine shard and is now ready to enter into material form, a form suitable for the earth expression of my attributes. So now this ideal soul body, like our ideal chair, it's now time to manifest that into reality. So we have this ideal chair, and we get ourselves a hammer and some nails, and we get some stuffing for the cushions, and we get the material, and we start making this chair. Well, if we've never made a chair before, there's a good chance, like a really good chance, that this chair is not going to be the ideal chair. It's not even going to get close. Now, we could also go out and shop for a chair that's not ours, that we didn't make. Try to match this ideal form in our mind. Probably not going to be able to do that exactly either. Here on Earth, we don't have the materials that are necessary to perfectly recreate the ideal form, this immortal soul body that God has created. So I believe this is telling us that the mortal form, it doesn't replace the soul body, it's still there. It kind of wraps around the soul body and imitates the soul body as close as it can here on Earth. And Gunn says that ideals are mortal in life because we change as we get older, so that ideas would have a mortality to them. Well, that's true that your ideal form would change over time, but what happened to your previous ideal form? Did it stop existing when you changed the form? That's just a totally metaphysical question. It really doesn't have anything to do with what we're looking at right here, but um, I'm thinking that once you project the form into your mind, that the reflections or echoes from it move out into eternity. But I don't know that's true or that the text or anything has told us that. And Gunn says that the previous idea just stopped, and that would have been the death of the idea. I understand what you're saying. So that could definitely be true as well. Although, let me ask, just for the sake of argument, what if you had told somebody about your perfect ideal chair when you were young, and then your ideal changed when you were older, but this other person has moved forward and made the ideal chair that you had, and it now exists, and other people copy it, and then a lot of people are sitting in this ideal chair. Has the ideal died? I don't know. They just have different kinds of lives, maybe, than. That's a whole other interesting thought pattern, though. And Gunn's asking which is the most important, the older ideal or the newer ideal? I would probably say the newer ideal because it's in the present or the now. And the past and the future don't truly exist. Those are, again, human concepts. We exist only here in the now. But it's an interesting question. I wouldn't bet anything on it at this moment. I haven't really thought about it enough. And then we go on in this book to this change from a mental to a mortal form took place after the manner and process of all thinking and all creating. So the change from a mental to a mortal form, all things went from the divine's imagination to the expression here in the mortal form on earth. It all happened the same way, which is the same process of thinking and creating, which we've already been told, which is that we are given inspiration. That's a divine idea. We take that divine idea, we pair it with divine desire. We add our imagination. We invoke power into the imagination, the creation of the imagination. And that power is the Holy Spirit, because all is unity, and therefore all power derives directly from the Holy Spirit. And then we manifest the idea into a reality here on earth. And we've been told this in this book. The last like 2 chapters have been going over this. this passage goes on and says it's literally described in the Bible. So he hasn't actually linked this creative process that Benner's told us about. He has not linked this directly to the Bible yet. But now he says it's described in the Bible, where it says, I formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living soul. I believe Benner's telling us this means that God manifested his ideal from the dust of the ground, poured in the Holy Spirit, which is the breath into his nostrils, the breath of life, and that man became a living soul. With that breath of life, that's where the shard of the divine fits in, now encased in the mortal body. But it's kind of confusing, and he says, shall I explain further? Because Joseph loves to circle and surround these ideas. So he's gonna, when you fly in a plane anywhere and you land some, they do the same thing at the airport. They circle around the airport, and then they finally land. That's what's happening here. Benner's flying this plane, and he keeps circling the airport for us so that we could see the objective before we get there and perhaps become obscured by perspective. And Gunn's saying that's what she's wondered, is this religion? Well, it's not religion specifically. It's a description of how to use religion in your life. So it's not the same as the scripture itself. It's more like the instructions for a stereo system. Oh, you're asking, is the ideal chairs a kind of a religion? From Plato? I don't think those were religious thoughts from Plato. I'm not really sure what Plato's religious thoughts were. I would assume they had something to do with Greek mythology. But by the time of Plato, I think learned people didn't really believe in the mythology, but I don't know. I've always remembered ever since I learned about his thoughts about how ideals work. And I could be misremembering that or not saying that correctly. It's not something I've looked up recently, but I believe that's how Plato thought about. I think he was saying it as this is the best practice in order to make the best creation. In other words, he spent a lot of time thinking about what he was going to write or create before he actually did it. And then he tried to get his creation to match that original imagination. So back to this book. Shall I explain further that the quickening power within my idea, your soul, proceeded to attract to it the various elements of life substance, dust. I think we could also think of this as atoms or elements, molecules, all those science-y description words for matter. And in fact, the text goes on and says, and atom by atom and cell by cell, in due course of time, to mold and shape each into bone, tissue, and organs, after the pattern of the thought image composing your soul body, thus forming an earthly outer covering, as it were, until finally your mortal form actually became manifest to the psychic sense of the outer world. Okay, we're going to stop. There's a comma here, so the sentence is not over, but what we've been told is that the body is made up of all these earthly elements. It's the earthly outer covering of the soul body, just as I thought it would be. I haven't read this chapter yet. And it's patterned after the thought image. So it's after the ideal form, or as God has told us before, we are made in the image of the divine. Now, if you wanted to attach a scientific explanation to this particular miracle, you might think of it as DNA, which is a double helix spiral. It's a pattern. And when the DNA pattern is repeated, it forms a body. That's kind of how birth works, right? You know, after the egg is fertilized, the cell begins to divide over and over. It's replicating the DNA. And as the DNA replicates over and over, it forms a human body. Now, back in Benner's time, he didn't know about DNA. So they wouldn't have known about this. But he did know about cells. And he's made this mental leap to this point. But he didn't know about the replicating spiral of DNA, which I think he would have loved to know that idea. And he would certainly have incorporated it into the book somewhere. And Gunn says, but isn't our natural way to think about thinking of an ideal thing and make it true, not religion especially? Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely correct. And that is what Benner is saying, is that the creation process is always the same, whether it's linked to religion or not. And then Plato, who would not have shared Benner's religion and lived so much earlier, he's an example that the creation process was working in the way that Benner is describing it. It's always worked in that way. And Gunn says that she feels Benner complicates things here. He's certainly wordy. And I think the wordiness, I think the style, the fact that he's talking to us as God himself, or as the I am inside of us, it's really supposed to be the I am inside of us. That is a very interesting method. And it's an interesting style. But I think the wordiness itself is kind of a late 19th, early 20th century writing thing. That they loved these words. Now, he uses words less than other people of the same era. So, compared to other writers of his time, he's fairly restrained, actually. But we're used to getting to the point a little bit quicker. And Gunn says that's why she talks about it, is because he complicates things. And it's okay. That is maybe what he's trying to do, because he wants you to talk about it. Especially if you don't agree about it, he wants you to outright tell him, I don't agree about this, because then the book's going to say, hey, it's okay. Go ahead and read to the end, and then let's talk about it again. And Gunn's saying that she feels the book could have been half as long. I think, that he could have summarized it into Cliff Notes as we would think of them today at the beginning. And that might have provided for especially people in our time, an easier entryway. I'm not sure if it would have helped anybody in his time because back then there wasn't any TV, right? There was no radio when Benner published this, or it was so early in the days of radio, there weren't any programmings on radio. Nobody was listening to the radio. There was no entertainment at home that you did not make yourself or read in a book. So you wouldn't have minded as much the length of the book or the spiraling of the book or not having a quick way in at the beginning because you were looking for something that would take some time. And you had limited resources. The books were expensive, so you wouldn't have had a lot of books probably. Nowadays, I think if you want somebody to read this book, and I think that's kind of what Elvis was doing, was he was summarizing little pieces into his annotation and then allowing the reader, they could flip through and find that annotation and just read that portion. And then they would not feel as Gunn is stating that it could have been half as long. And Gunn says, but Elvis read it in our time and he liked it. That's another excellent point. Why did Elvis like it? Because he was searching and this spoke directly to him. This is what he wanted to find. Therefore, he was willing to devour it all. Elvis read a lot of books, but he was very contained in his taste of those books, right? Like he didn't move outside of his chosen genres very much. He liked the spiritual searching and the religious stuff. We saw that he did read The Omen, which was a fictional novel, but it had a direct tie back to the spiritual things. So as a voracious reader, obviously he would have strayed outside of his own circle from time to time, but he remained very, very centralized on this. So this was his passion. But you have to have kind of a passion for this. We are substituting our passion for Elvis as the passion that he had for the book in order to power ourselves through this material. And we have to all get together to do it. So that tells you something about Elvis. He needed what was said in this book, at least those parts he underlined and that he wrote about. He needed that. It was just part of his spiritual makeup. And this passage goes on and says, if not yet to the physical eye, whereupon all being now prepared for this cyclical movement, you my attribute breathed into, and then through its nostrils from within the breath of life, and you then made your first appearance on earth as a tangible human being, a living soul, my idea now able to express consciously through a suitable earth medium, containing within yourself all my attributes, all my powers, and all my possibilities. Now, the first thing that I pull out of this whole section, which is really just a restatement of the last sentence, that this is how God creates man, is that Benner he's moved beyond Genesis at this point to a reflection or echo of Genesis across all time, which is the birth of every human being. That every birth replicates the birth of Adam or the creation of Adam. That what happened in Genesis happens over and over and over every day, every time a human being is born. And that each of these are a living soul containing within themselves all of the divine's attributes, all of the divine's powers, and all of the possibilities. This isn't even saying we're a shard. It's saying that we could potentially be the divine, that we contain those possibilities within ourselves because the divine loves us. We always have to remember that overlaid on everything Benner is saying is an equation that I am God equals love. So all these attributes, all the powers, all the possibilities, those are also love. And Gunn also points out that Elvis liked athletic history and karate books. That is true. So he did expand beyond just the spiritual, although I think the karate linked to the spiritual. I think the karate lasted as long as it did now that we've seen the spiritual side because it formed the basis of the meditation that he was able to access some of these ideas that he encountered in the spiritual books. And I think the history was, well, I don't know, because we really don't know all the books that Elvis had, right? Like, I would love to have a whole list, and people tend to focus on the spiritual, so we see these lists of spiritual books. And that may give us a false idea of the depth and breadth of Elvis's library. And I know he did like some history books. I'm just wondering if that was before he began the spiritual books and that he was looking for spiritual resonance in historical events, but I don't really know that. And then, of course, football. He loved to read books about football and such. Although that makes me wonder if we could attach football to a spiritual event as well, that his mind would have maybe been clear after he played some football. You know, it would distance him from his normal secular self. And Gunn says football too. Yeah, I'm riffing off when you said athletic. And that made me think about the football. And I know I've seen some books he owned about football. So let's move to this next paragraph that says, thus were now manifest all the various mediums for the earth expression of my idea, and you, being one of my attributes, naturally had dominion over all of these mediums, or possessed the power of utilizing any or all of them if necessary, for the full and complete expression of my attributes, powers, and possibilities. I think this was probably said in a more streamlined sense in Genesis, where if I remember correctly, it said something about God gave all of the animals and plants and the world basically to Adam and Eve to be used. And that I believe that continued even after he threw them out of the Garden of Eden. And that it was natural for Adam to have dominion over all of these mediums, which is what's said here. Adam was an attribute. He had all of the divine attributes, so naturally he had dominion over all of these mediums. And in this manner and for this reason alone did you and your brothers and sisters come into human expression. So the reason that all of humanity exists is to express various divine attributes. Then it says, but while in human form, yet was your expression so entirely impersonal that though self-conscious, you still looked wholly to me within for inspiration and guidance. This is talking about in Genesis when Adam and Eve talked directly with God before the original sin. They had a direct relate. God wasn't just inside them. He came and he spoke to them. They had time together, like a father with his children and the family. And when we say, or when Benner says impersonal, he means that Adam and Eve's personality, their ego, their individualism had not grown to a point that obscured their communication with the I Am. They had never turned away. They were aligned, had always been aligned, could not conceive of being misaligned. They were part of unity. The next paragraph says, this then was the first condition into which you awakened when you entered into earth expression, and is what is called the Edenic state or dwelling in the Garden of Eden. Benner is again referencing the echoes of Genesis throughout human history. So the Garden of Eden was a time period in which Adam and Eve had never sinned, had been completely aligned, could not even conceive of being misaligned. And Benner is telling us that when we are born, we're in the same state. So, although Benner has not said newborn here, and I have mistakenly brought newborn in before, I think that is what he's talking about here. That we each begin our journey through the mortal realm with direct communication to God, that the I Am in our heart speaks directly with us, and that at some point our personality forms and we give it enough power that we turn away from God. And that this is the natural progression. This is the progression that's meant to be, even though it saddens God. But it's part of what's required for the expression of the divine attributes here on earth. It says, this Edenic state represents the celestial phase of impersonal consciousness, or that state in which you were still consciously one with me, though now confined in a mortal medium of expression. We're again being told there was a time when you and I were together, when we were one. You knew it. You had not broken away. Like a bird in a nest, though, there comes a time you're going to have to fly away. That's part of this experience here. But in that first part, when you're still in the nest, you're still one. Everybody's still one. But that is the true state. And then the book says, now I shall not tell you in detail how or why it became necessary for me to drive you, now manifesting as man or humanity, out of the Garden of Eden. And that is a reflection of a mother bird pushes a young bird out of the nest. There comes a time when she has to drive them away. And God has had to do that in order to fulfill this project that we're in, the real earth, the divine idea. But he's not going to tell us why that was necessary. I am apparently jumping to a conclusion that it was necessary in order to complete the real earth. But he says, other than to remind you of the part that desire plays in earth expression and its relation to my will. I think that tells us we were driven out because God desired that we be driven out in order to have these experiences. And it says how it centers your interest in outer things and makes you forget me within. I think this is telling us that God sends us divine desire along with those divine ideas. And that at some point we take that desire, we focus it through the lens of the personality or the ego, the personal, as opposed to the impersonal, which is unity. You know, we start to care about what's really, it says here, your interest. What concerns us? What's best for us? What's best for me? We focus the desire, the divine desire, to that lens, and it becomes our desire. It still has the power of divine desire, but it's not serving directly divine desire. We are still serving. We're walking along and fulfilling the path, the need that God has for us in this painting, the real earth. But we are not doing it consciously, and we are consciously twisting that desire to be something selfish for us. And it says, when you have solved that and comprehend somewhat of my reason, then perhaps you can understand the necessity of first causing your consciousness or humanity's consciousness to fall into a deep sleep. You having approached the close of another cycle called a cosmic day, and of letting you think you had awakened, but in reality you were still asleep and only dreaming, of finding yourself, humanity, no longer outwardly one, but two, one an active, thinking, aggressive part, thereafter called a man, and the other a passive, feeling, receptive part, or a womb man or a woman. And so in the next episode, we're going to talk about genders, apparently. And we're going to come back to that same paragraph and we're going to look at it in a lot more detail. And Pat says that Gunn has a lot of good questions and Pat's just still trying to take it all in. And I think that Bender, he knows that about the book. And that if you actually try to read it all the way through, I think you're going to have Pat's experience that you're just going to try to take it all in the whole time. Now with Elvis, I think he instinctively felt like this was answering his question. So I think he just devoured this thing in like 48 hours. And I don't think he stopped to, deeply think about any of those parts. And then he jumped back into it. But he was coming from a point where he'd already been deeply thinking about these pieces. I think anyone that he gave them to, I think we can congratulate ourselves that anyone that he gave this book to probably did not read it to chapter 9. That we've already overcome many of those obstacles that were in their way, and that we've made it further into this text than probably 95% of the people Elvis gave it to. And Gunn's saying, do we know how many pages in the book that was underlined? Half of the text, every page, or did he underline in his own book? Do we know? Well, from each of the books that I've seen, there's like roughly 5 to 8, maybe 10 pages. However, I don't know that those are all the pages that are underlined, because they've only taken like the best examples. And typically only the ones that have writing on the page as well. So we don't really get to see any of these books in their entirety. Altogether, right now, I think I've pulled maybe 12 or 15 pages that have something on them from these various sources. Plus, he wrote stuff in the front covers. So I would say that we really cannot make any judgment about how much of the book is or is not underlined or notated. I feel it must be much more of the book than what we see. Even that one that we saw from Gary, we only saw, I think that was 9 pages. My feeling is there's a lot more pages because the book's a lot longer. And Gunn says that she's with Pat and doesn't understand a lot, and that they're both glad they're not the only one. And you're not the only one. I don't understand it all that much either. But we're going to keep on working through it and see if we can't. I'm determined to finish. We're going to at least finish this book. And then I kind of really would like to go on to The Prophet, which he read before this. And maybe that's where I made the error. Maybe we should have read that one before. But this one seems to connect so much closer to the events of 1967, the Circle G, all that stuff we were looking at. But I do think it's fascinating. But for now, we're going to leave on another song. And this one is going to be Quiet Light. And I want to thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me and helping us get through this book. And until I see you guys all again, you all keep on taking care of business. This is Quiet Light.
Beauty walks soft as a whisper, yet thunders like storms overhead. Kind and gentle in its passing, still a thing of might and dread. And the word became a lantern, placed in trembling human hands, saying, "Child, behold my glory, not in faces, but in hearts that understand. For the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome. Every soul receives a lantern, every wanderer is called home. He wrote truth in quiet margins for the ones who read between. Faith will conquer, said the giver. I am the light you've always seen." Beauty's not the mask we're wearing, not the mirrors feeding grace. Beauty burns within the heart space, kindness casting God's own shadow on the contours of a face. And the I am speaks in stillness, in the breath between each thought. The soul remembers union with the love it never lost. For the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome. Every soul receives a lantern, Distance only closes in the moment when the veil of flesh is torn. Yet the word says I am with you from the instant you are born. Dreams stay cold, room silent, body, mind and spirit still as one. In that hush the lantern brightens and the night becomes undone. Be as gentle as the lamb is when you're dealing out your love. Be as fearless as the lion when you guard what's holy from above. Let your honor strike like lightning, swift and righteous in its speed. For the light that lives within you is the strength behind the creed. For the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome. Every soul receives a lantern, every seeker finds the one. He wrote truth in quiet margins as a gift for those in need. Faith will conquer, said the giver. Walk in light and you are free. And the I am whispers softly as the lantern warms your hand. I am beauty, I am kindness, I am the light.